My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the baby monitor, ensuring every corner of the nursery was visible. It was the first time Jack and I were leaving our little Ethan alone since his birth 3 weeks ago. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Harper, had insisted we take a break, and reluctantly, I agreed. Before leaving, I carefully showed her Ethan's sleep sack, emphasizing how important it was not to use any blankets, especially near his face. "You're just being paranoid," she had chuckled, but I saw her nod, so I left, feeling a tad reassured. The cafe where Jack and I sat was cozy, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing at my phone, the live feed from the baby monitor playing. Jack reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "He'll be fine," he assured me, but his words did little to soothe my anxiety. About an hour into our lunch, I noticed something on the monitor that made my heart skip a beat. Mrs. Harper was swaddling Ethan, not with the sleep sack, but with a blanket tightly wrapped around his hips. My instructions had been clear, and yet there she was doing the exact opposite. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "Jack, we need to go." "Now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We hurried back, finding Ethan asleep in his crib, the blanket still snug around him. Mrs. Harper greeted us with a smile, oblivious to my distress. "He just wouldn't settle without a swaddle," she explained. I bit back my frustration, nodding politely while inside I seethed. It was more than just a disregard for my instructions, it was a blatant disrespect for my role as Ethan's mother. Strike one, I thought bitterly. That night, as Jack slept soundly, I lay awake, Ethan's soft breathing the only sound in the dark room. The incident replayed in my mind, fueling a growing resolve. I needed to be firmer, set clearer boundaries. My child's safety was at stake, and I wouldn't let anyone, not even Mrs. Harper, undermine that. Weeks had passed since the first incident, and my trust in Mrs. Harper remained shaky. Yet, when Jack suggested another brief outing, a movie this time, I agreed, but with one addition: I had installed cameras in the house. It wasn't just about watching Ethan, it was about ensuring my instructions were followed. Before leaving, I walked Mrs. Harper through Ethan's routine again, stressing the importance of using the sleep sack and not swaddling him with a blanket. I also asked her to send me pictures or updates, as being away from Ethan still made me anxious. Her response was curt, almost dismissive. "Maybe, if I have time," she said, adding that I should keep my phone silent in the cinema. Her tone stung, and I left feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. In the dim light of the movie theater, I found myself checking the live feed on my phone more than watching the screen. Mrs. Harper seemed to be taking adequate care of Ethan, but there were no messages, no pictures, nothing. Frustrated, I nudged Jack, whispering about what was happening. Reluctantly, he texted his mother, and only then did a couple of photos come through. It wasn't just about the pictures. It was her attitude, the way she disregarded my requests as if they were unimportant. After the movie, Jack tried to reassure me. "She sent the photos, didn't she?" he said, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't about the photos. It was about respect, about listening to the mother of the child she was caring for. I felt a growing rift, not just with Mrs. Harper, but with Jack too, for not understanding my concerns. That night, as I held Ethan close, feeding him before bed, I felt a deepening resolve. This wasn't something I could just let slide. My role as a mother was being questioned, my instructions ignored. It was more than just a simple disagreement, it was a fundamental clash of beliefs and values about how to care for my child. And I knew then that something had to change. In the weeks that followed, the tension between Mrs. Harper and me grew palpable. Each visit from her seemed to widen the gap of misunderstanding and distrust. Jack, trying to play the mediator, often found himself caught in the crossfire of our silent battles. The third strike came unannounced, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Mrs. Harper was babysitting Ethan while I caught up on some work from home. From my study, I could hear her cooing and talking to Ethan, a sound that should have brought comfort, but instead heightened my alertness. I decided to check on them, a decision that led to the ignition of a smoldering conflict. I found Mrs. Harper pulling Ethan's hands away from his mouth, her actions more forceful than necessary. "He'll become a thumbsucker if you let him do that," she scolded, not noticing my presence. I watched, horrified, as she aggressively shoved a pacifier into his mouth. My heart raced. This was not just about a pacifier or thumb-sucking. It was about her overstepping, controlling how I chose to raise my son. I confronted her then and there, my voice firm yet trembling with restrained emotion. "Mrs. Harper, it's perfectly normal for babies his age to explore with their hands. Please don't do that." Her response was a mix of disbelief and defiance. "I raised 3 children. I think I know what I'm doing," she retorted, her tone dismissive. The final straw came later that day when we argued about how to put Ethan to sleep. Despite my insistence on following pediatrician recommendations to lay him on his back, Mrs. Harper argued relentlessly for the old ways she was accustomed to. It was a clash of generations, of old beliefs versus new, scientifically backed practices. That evening, as I lay in bed, a torrent of emotions swept over me. Frustration, anger, helplessness. Jack, sensing my distress, tried to offer comfort, but his words felt empty. "She means well," he said, but that was no longer enough. Mrs. Harper's actions were not just infuriating, they were a direct challenge to my authority as Ethan's mother. I realized then that my relationship with Mrs. Harper had reached a critical point. I could no longer allow her to undermine my parenting choices, no matter her intentions. The safety and well-being of Ethan were paramount, and I was determined to protect that, even if it meant confronting and possibly alienating Mrs. Harper. My role as a mother was clear, and I knew I had to stand my ground for Ethan's sake. Spring brought with it a new challenge, one that threatened to upend the precarious balance I had managed to maintain with Mrs. Harper. During a casual family dinner, she announced her retirement, her voice laced with a mix of pride and anticipation. What followed, however, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. She offered to become Ethan's full-time caregiver, a proposition that caught me completely off guard. Jack seemed thrilled by the idea, seeing it as a perfect solution. "Think of the money we'll save on childcare," he said enthusiastically. But for me, the thought of leaving Ethan in Mrs. Harper's care every day was daunting. Her previous actions, her disregard for my parenting choices, echoed loudly in my mind. That night, as Jack slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, wrestling with the dilemma. On one hand, there were the undeniable financial benefits, and on the other, my deep-seated concerns about Mrs. Harper's approach to childcare. It wasn't just about differing opinions. It was about the safety and well-being of my son. I found myself torn between the pragmatic part of me that recognized the practicality of the offer and the maternal instinct that screamed against it. Could I trust Mrs. Harper to respect my wishes and care for Ethan as I wanted? The answer, based on past experiences, seemed grim. The days that followed were filled with internal debates and discussions with Jack, who couldn't understand my hesitation. "She's his grandmother. She won't do anything to harm him," he reasoned. But it wasn't about harm in the conventional sense. It was about respecting my role as Ethan's mother, about adhering to the practices and precautions I deemed necessary for his well-being. As spring blossomed into summer, the pressure to make a decision mounted. Mrs. Harper's offer hung over our household like an unspoken ultimatum, challenging my convictions as a parent. The thought of her becoming Ethan's primary caregiver filled me with a sense of foreboding. I knew I had to make a choice, one that would not only affect our current circumstances, but also define the boundaries of our family dynamics for years to come. In the end, the decision came down to a simple yet profound realization. My responsibility as Ethan's mother was to ensure his safety and happiness, even if it meant making the difficult choice of saying no to Mrs. Harper. It was a decision that wouldn't be easy to communicate, but one that I knew was necessary. My resolve was clear, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The decision to decline Mrs. Harper's offer weighed heavily on me, like a stone in my stomach. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of the impending confrontation filled me with dread. It wasn't just about saying no to her. It was about asserting my role as Ethan's mother and setting boundaries that had long been blurred. I approached Jack first, hoping to find an ally in him before facing Mrs. Harper. We sat down one evening after Ethan was asleep, the soft glow of the nightlight casting shadows across the room. "Jack, I've thought a lot about your mom's offer," I began, my voice steady but laced with anxiety. "And I've decided that it's not the best option for Ethan or for us." Jack looked surprised, maybe even a bit disappointed. "But think about the money we'd save," he argued, echoing his earlier sentiments. I nodded, acknowledging the practicality of his point. I understand that, but this is about more than money. It's about Ethan's well-being and having our parenting choices respected, I explained, my words deliberate, conveying the seriousness of my concerns. The conversation that followed was difficult. Jack struggled to see my perspective, rooted in his trust and love for his mother. But as I laid out my reasons, highlighting the past incidents and Mrs. Harper's dismissive attitude towards my parenting choices, he began to understand. It wasn't an easy acceptance, but it was a start. With Jack's reluctant support, I braced myself for the conversation with Mrs. Harper. I invited her over for coffee, a neutral setting for what I anticipated would be a challenging discussion. As she sat across from me, sipping her coffee, I took a deep breath and spoke. Mrs. Harper, I appreciate your offer to take care of Ethan. It means a lot, but I've decided that it's best for us to continue with our current childcare arrangement. Her reaction was a mix of surprise and hurt, her brows knitting together in confusion. But why? I thought it would be perfect, she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. I explained my stance, carefully choosing words that conveyed respect but also firmness. It's important for me to have certain practices followed, and while I value your experience, I feel more comfortable sticking to the advice of our pediatrician and current childcare provider. The conversation was tense, with moments of silent understanding and others filled with veiled frustration. In the end, Mrs. Harper left with a polite goodbye, the air between us thick with unspoken words. As the door closed behind her, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I had made my decision, set my boundaries, but at what cost? The future of our family dynamics hung in a delicate balance, but I knew that standing up for my beliefs and for Ethan's welfare was the right choice, no matter the challenges it might bring. The days following my conversation with Mrs. Harper were filled with an uneasy quiet. The air was thick with unspoken words and lingering tension, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the storm broke. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Harper had come over for a visit, her demeanor cordial but distant. As she interacted with Ethan, I could sense her holding back, her movements cautious, as if walking on a tightrope. The atmosphere was strained, a stark contrast to the easy familiarity that had once defined our gatherings. Then, as Ethan fussed in his playpen, Mrs. Harper turned to me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I don't understand why you don't trust me with Ethan. I raised 3 children of my own." Her words hit me like a wave, pulling me into the undercurrent of our unresolved issues. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's not about trust, Mrs. Harper," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "It's about respecting the choices Jack and I make for Ethan. It's about his safety and well-being." What followed was a raw and honest exchange, the kind that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Mrs. Harper expressed her feelings of being undervalued and misunderstood, while I shared my need for my role as a mother to be respected. We delved into our differing views on childcare, each of us standing our ground, yet trying to find common ground. The conversation was not without its moments of heat. Mrs. Harper's frustration was palpable, as was my determination to assert my authority as Ethan's mother. But, amidst the contention, there was also a sense of mutual understanding beginning to form, a recognition of each other's concerns and emotions. As the afternoon waned, the tension gradually eased, leaving in its wake a fragile truce. We had not resolved all our differences, but there was a newfound respect for each other's perspectives. Mrs. Harper agreed to try to respect my parenting decisions, and I acknowledged her experience and love for Ethan. That day marked a turning point in our relationship. It was the beginning of a journey towards mutual respect and understanding, one that would require patience, empathy, and open communication. The confrontation had been challenging, but it had opened the door to a potential path of reconciliation and compromise, a path that I hoped would lead to a more harmonious family dynamic. In the weeks that followed our confrontation, the dynamic within our family began to shift, subtly yet significantly. The air of tension that had once clouded our interactions with Mrs. Harper started to dissipate, giving way to a cautious but growing sense of understanding. Mrs. Harper's visits became more frequent, but they were different now. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a delicate balance of respect for each other's roles in Ethan's life. She was more mindful of my requests, and I, in turn, made an effort to appreciate her experience and perspective as a grandmother. Jack noticed the change too. He was relieved to see his mother and me finding a middle ground, and our relationship, which had been strained by the situation, began to heal. We had more open discussions about parenting and the roles of our extended family, conversations that brought us closer and strengthened our partnership. The most significant change, however, was within myself. The journey through the conflicts with Mrs. Harper had been a challenging one, but it had also been transformative. I found a new sense of confidence in my role as a mother, a deeper understanding of the importance of setting boundaries, and the courage to stand up for what I believed was best for Ethan. As spring turned into summer, our family settled into a new rhythm, one that embraced both tradition and change. Mrs. Harper became a supportive presence in Ethan's life, respecting the boundaries we had established. And I found a new respect for her, not just as Jack's mother or Ethan's grandmother, but as a woman with her own set of experiences and wisdom. Our story didn't have a dramatic conclusion, no definitive moment of triumph or defeat. Instead, it was a gradual journey towards mutual respect and understanding, a journey that taught us the value of empathy, communication, and compromise. As I watched Ethan grow, surrounded by love and care from all sides, I realized that our family's strength didn't lie in always agreeing with each other, but in our ability to navigate our differences with respect and love. And in that realization, I found not just peace, but a profound sense of gratitude for the family we were building together, with all its complexities and imperfections.
The town library was a sanctuary for many, including me. I always found comfort amidst its tall wooden shelves and the scent of old pages. That day, as the sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow on everything, I was engrossed in the romance section, trying to find a book that I hadn't read. A soft thud and the flutter of pages startled me, and I looked up to find myself almost nose to nose with a man who appeared just as surprised. He had hazel eyes that sparkled with amusement and a slightly disheveled tuft of brown hair. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, realizing I'd knocked a few books out of his hands. "I should have been more careful," he chuckled. "No harm done. I'm David," he said, extending a hand to help pick up the scattered books. "Amelia," I replied, grateful for the friendly gesture. As we collected the books, our fingers brushed against each other, causing a tiny jolt of electricity. I glanced up to see if he felt it too. From the faint blush on his cheeks, it seemed he did. "So, Amelia," David began, breaking the momentary silence, "are you always this engrossed in your book choices?" I laughed. "Only when I can't decide on my next fictional escape. How about you? What brings you to the library?" "I've been trying to find a good book on photography," he admitted, pointing to the stack in his hands. "It's more than just a hobby for me." Our conversation turned to hobbies, dreams, and even our favorite foods. It was surprising how easy it was to talk to David. We ended up abandoning our book search and found a cozy corner in the library's cafe. Hours seemed to fly by as cups of coffee turned cold and our conversation delved deeper. "I've always loved this library," David confessed, looking around with a nostalgic smile. "I used to come here with my mom. She'd read to me for hours." "It sounds lovely," I said, thinking about my own childhood memories. "It was," David replied with a distant look in his eyes, "but things change." There was an unspoken depth to that statement, hinting at stories yet untold. It made me even more curious about him. We left the library with a promise to meet again. From that day on, David and I were inseparable. Each date felt like an exploration, not just of the places we went to, but of each other's worlds. The bond we shared grew stronger, leading us to a beautiful wedding day where I felt like everything was falling into place. Yet amidst all the joy, one figure stood out, casting a long shadow on our happiness. David's mother, Mrs. Marin Hughes. Her sharp gaze always seemed to linger on me a little too long, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. I hoped that with time she'd see how much David and I loved each other and accept our union. But that was a hope soon to be tested. The excitement of expecting a baby was overshadowed by the constant nausea and fatigue I felt every morning. It was a battle, and by evening I was utterly exhausted. David watched with concern, always by my side, supporting me in every way he could. One evening, after a particularly rough day, David approached the subject. "Amelia, maybe we should think about moving closer to family for a while, just until the baby comes." I hesitated. Moving back to David's family home meant being closer to Moran. "Do you think that's a good idea?" I asked, uncertainty in my voice. He took my hand gently. "It's just a thought. Mom did raise 3 kids. She might help with the baby stuff, and, more importantly, support you when I'm at work." I pondered over it. "I'm just worried about how things are with your mom," I admitted. David sighed. "I know Mom can be a bit difficult, but she's still family. Maybe with the baby on the way, things might change. Give her a chance." With a deep breath, I agreed. "All right, but if things get tough, we need to have a backup plan." The move happened quicker than I anticipated. David's childhood home was a large, old-fashioned house with creaking floorboards and a sense of history. The first day we arrived, Moran greeted us at the door, a broad smile on her face. "Welcome home, David," she said, hugging her son tightly. Then, turning to me, her tone softened. "And you too, Amelia. I hope your stay here is comfortable." For the first few days, Moran was the image of a doting mother-in-law. She made my favourite meals, helped me set up the nursery, and shared stories of David's childhood. It was almost as if the icy tension from before had melted away. One evening, while David and I were in the living room, Marin joined us with a tray of hot cocoa. Handing me a cup, she said, "You know, Amelia, pregnancy suits you. You look radiant." I smiled. "Thanks, Marin." "And thank you for everything you've been doing. It's been a great help," she nodded. "It's the least I can do. Family takes care of each other." The words sounded reassuring, but a faint trace of something in her eyes made me wonder. It seemed like a perfect setup, a haven I hadn't expected. But as the days turned to weeks, subtle changes began to emerge. The sweet facade Moran put up began to show cracks, especially when David wasn't around. I tried to brush off the unease, hoping that my pregnancy hormones were just making me overly sensitive. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Marian's kindness than met the eye. The days in the old house started to feel longer, with David often away at work. It was mostly just Marian and me. It didn't take long for her kind behavior to shift when we were alone. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making a sandwich. Marin walked in, looked at what I was preparing, and said, "You know, David always liked his sandwiches with more mayo, but I guess he's settled for less now." Taken aback, I replied, "I didn't know that. He never told me." She shrugged. "There's a lot you don't know about my son." Days like this became more common. It was always a comment here, a remark there. Each time, she made sure David wasn't around to hear. One day, I was resting in the living room, going through some baby names. Moran came and sat next to me. "You know, Amelia," she began, "if only David had chosen someone more, well, someone better suited to our family." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean, Moran?" She leaned in closer. "Let's be honest. You've struggled so much with this pregnancy. It makes me wonder if you'll be able to handle what comes next." I felt a sting in my eyes, holding back tears. "I'm doing my best," I whispered. "Inside, for David's sake, I hope your best is good enough. Every interaction became a challenge. I tried to avoid being alone with her, but she always found a way. The house felt oppressive, and I started to dread each day. The only solace was David's comforting presence when he came home. But even with him, I hesitated to speak up, fearing it might cause a rift between mother and son. Things got even more strained when David informed us of a business trip he had to take. "It's just for a few days," he assured me, pulling me into a hug. "Mom will be here with you. Everything will be all right." The night before his trip, I overheard David talking to Maren in the hallway. "Please, Mother," he said, his voice filled with concern, "promise me you'll take care of Amelia." Marian's voice was sugary sweet as she replied, "Of course, my dear. Don't you worry. I'll look after her." I went to bed that night with a heavy heart, sensing that the storm was far from over with David gone. The house's atmosphere grew thicker than ever. Every room I walked into felt like stepping onto a battlefield with Maren. But as the days went by, I realized that I couldn't just keep dodging her verbal attacks. I needed to defend myself and maybe even counterattack. The day after David left, I sat in our shared living room, browsing through online forums for advice on dealing with difficult family members. The consensus was clear, evidence was crucial. That's when the idea of the voice recorder struck me. If I could capture Marian's words, I could finally show David her true nature. The very next day, I made a trip to a local electronics store. As I was browsing through the different recorders available, a friendly store assistant approached. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. "Something that can record voice discreetly," I answered. He nodded, showing me a small device. "This one's quite popular, easy to conceal, and clear audio quality." I bought it immediately, feeling like I'd acquired a shield against Maren. Upon returning home, I found Maren in the living room. She was going through a photo album, probably reminiscing about the past. "Ah, Amelia," she said without looking up, "come see these photos of David when he was young, so innocent and pure before all this." I sat down, my new recorder discreetly activated in my pocket. "He always speaks fondly of his childhood," I remarked, trying to keep the conversation neutral. She gave a half-smile. "Well, he had a mother who cared for him, who knew how to bring up a child properly, unlike some." I took a deep breath, attempting to stay calm. "I'm sure we all do our best for our loved ones, Maren," she scoffed. "Doing one's best and knowing what's best are two different things. I just hope my grandchild doesn't suffer due to your inexperience." I nodded, biting back a retort. "Thank you for the advice, Maren." Little did she know that every snide remark was being captured. The days dragged on, and I gathered more evidence. Simultaneously, I started searching for an escape plan, a place of my own where I could breathe. After a thorough search, I stumbled upon a quaint apartment nearby. It felt right, a sanctuary from Maren's constant onslaught. One evening, as I went over my recordings and thought about the apartment, I felt a surge of hope. This was more than just about standing up to Maren. It was about securing a peaceful future for my child and me. It was about ensuring David knew the truth. With renewed energy, I prepared for the days ahead, knowing they wouldn't be easy, but believing they'd be worth it. A few days had passed since David's departure. Despite my attempts to keep a distance, Maren seemed to be pushing harder, testing my limits. One particular evening, after dinner, she decided to bring up the topic of baby names. I was in the living room looking through a baby name book David had built for us. "Naming a child is a significant task," she began, settling herself on the sofa opposite me. "It should be done with care." I looked up, nodding. "David and I have a list we're considering, a few options." Maren tilted her head, her eyes sharp. "Well, let's hear them." Taking a deep breath, I began. "We're thinking of Lily if it's a girl, or Ethan if it's a boy." She rolled her eyes. Lily sounds like a name for a pet, and Ethan so common. I felt my cheeks heat up. They're just options. We haven't decided. Maran leaned in, her voice cold. You know, in our family, we have traditions. David was named after his grandfather. Maybe you should respect that instead of choosing random names from a book. Stung by her words, I replied, David and I will name our child together. It's our decision. She stood up abruptly, knocking the book from my hands. You're so ungrateful. I've tried to help, to guide you, but you're just bent on ruining my son's life and that of my grandchild. I was taken aback. Maran, I never asked for your help. All I wanted was some peace. With a mocking laugh, she retorted, Peace? You think you deserve peace after everything you've done? You've turned my son against me. That was the last straw. I haven't done anything. It's you who can't let go and let him live his life. Marin's face turned a deep shade of red. You ungrateful wretch, she yelled, pointing towards the door. Leave! I don't even want that child to be born. Shaken, I tried to hold back tears. This is my home too. But Maran was relentless. She reached into my bag, grabbing my keys, and tossed them out the door. There, now go. Breathing hard with my emotions in a whirl, I took a moment to gather myself. I remembered the apartment I had rented, my sanctuary. Picking up my bag, I looked Marin in the eye. You might regret this. Without waiting for a reply, I stepped out, closing the door behind me. It was clear the battle lines had been drawn. The next few days in the apartment were a mix of peace and apprehension. I missed David terribly and worried about how he would react to everything once he returned. The day of David's return finally arrived. My phone buzzed with a message from him. Just landed, coming home soon, can't wait to see you. I replied, I'm at the new apartment. Call me when you get to the house. 2 hours later, David called. His voice was a mix of confusion and concern. Amelia, why are you in an apartment? Where's all your stuff? Why aren't you home? I took a deep breath. David, there's a lot you need to know. After explaining everything from the voice recordings to the final confrontation with Maran, there was silence on the other end. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. When David arrived, I played him the recordings. His face turned from shock to anger with every word Marin spewed. I can't believe she said all those things to you. I'm so sorry, Amelia, he said, taking my hand. David, it's not your fault. I just couldn't stay there anymore. His eyes were fierce. We're confronting her together. We drove back to the house, and as we entered, Maran was sitting in the living room, feigning surprise. David, welcome back. Where's Amelia? David's voice was ice cold. She's right here, and we've heard everything. Marin looked between us, trying to gauge the situation. I don't know what you're talking about. Without saying a word, David played one of the most damning recordings. Marin's face paled. When it ended, David's voice trembled with anger. How could you, Mother? She's carrying our child, your grandchild. Marin started crying. I just wanted the best for you. David shook his head. Your version of the best isn't what I want. Amelia and our baby are my family now. You need to respect that. Maran sobbed harder, trying to reach out to David, but he stepped back. I need some time away from all this. Taking my hand, David led me out of the house, and we drove back to the apartment. The rift between mother and son was evident, but in that moment our bond grew stronger. United against the deceit we had faced, the new apartment was a stark contrast to the opulence of the house we had left. It was cozy, with sunlight streaming in through large windows. There was something liberating about this modest space. It felt like the fresh start we desperately needed, a place where David and I could rebuild our life and prepare for the arrival of our baby without any dark clouds hanging over us. David and I spent the first few days setting things up. We transformed the second bedroom into a nursery, picking out neutral tones for the walls and assembling furniture piece by piece. As we painted the baby's room one afternoon, David said, "You know, all things considered, this place feels more like home than the big house ever did." I smiled, dipping my brush into the paint. "It does, doesn't it? It's smaller, but feels warmer." While putting up a shelf, David found a photo from our wedding day tucked inside a book. "Look at us," he remarked, passing me the photograph. Our smiles radiated pure joy, blissfully unaware of the storms ahead. "We've come a long way since then," I mused, placing the photo on the freshly painted shelf. "But we've also grown stronger together." David wrapped an arm around me. "I still feel guilty, Amelia. I thought going back to that house to my mother would be the solution. How wrong I was." I looked up at him. "It's not your fault, David. We made that decision together, and now we're starting anew together." A few days later, an unexpected package arrived. No return address, but we recognized the handwriting. Inside was a meticulously knit baby blanket, soft to the touch, accompanied by a note. Reading it aloud, David's voice was filled with mixed emotions. "I hope this can mend our relationship, Moran." We exchanged glances, both pondering the same question. Could things ever go back to the way they were? After a deep sigh, I said, "It's a beautiful blanket, and I appreciate the effort." David nodded in understanding. "I know. We need to protect our peace, our family. The past has shown us that." We were unified in our decision. Our focus was the life we were creating, the family we were building, and the love that remained unshakable. The baby's imminent arrival was our beacon of hope, and every corner of the apartment was a testament to that. We had carved out a sanctuary, distancing ourselves from past hurts and looking forward to a future filled with love and trust. Our new apartment became a symphony of baby cries and joyous laughter. Sophie, with her tufts of brown hair and curious hazel eyes reminiscent of David, was our pride and joy. The tough times we'd weathered seemed distant, like a storm that had passed, leaving only clear skies behind. David and I often found ourselves marveling at the little life we'd created. Late one night, as we were both up attending to a fussy Sophie, he looked at me with admiration. "You're incredible, you know, getting through everything with Moran and now being such an amazing mum." I smiled, gently rocking Sophie. "We did it together, and look at what we have now." I gestured to our daughter, who was slowly drifting back to sleep. One Sunday afternoon, as Sophie played on her mat, David proposed a little outing. "How about a trip to the library tomorrow? It's where our story began. I think it's time Sophie knows that place." I nodded in agreement. "Sounds perfect. We can make it a family tradition." The next day, the library greeted us with its familiar silence. We showed Sophie the very spot where we had met. David, holding her little hand, whispered, "This is where I met your mom, where our family story began." In that moment, standing in the midst of aisles filled with countless stories, we felt grateful for our own. We had faced challenges, yes, but they had shaped our journey, guiding us to this present moment. The library had been the start of our story, and now it played a part in Sophie's. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, life continued its rhythm. We shared tales of bravery and love with Sophie, always emphasizing the importance of standing up for oneself and one's family. Marin, although a part of our past, barely featured in our conversations. One evening, while putting Sophie to bed, I realized the true weight of the decisions we had made. By choosing our family's happiness and well-being over external pressures, we had set a foundation for Sophie to grow up knowing the value of love, trust, and resilience. With Sophie asleep, I walked out to the living room where David was waiting. We sat, hands entwined, looking at the city lights. The world outside held challenges and uncertainties, but in our little apartment there was only warmth, love, and the promise of many tomorrows.
You can't even afford the fancier cuts of meat, even if you're at a BBQ establishment, can you? The impoverished have more than enough pickles. David, a banker who used to be my classmate, scowled down at me and violently dumped a plate of juicy pickles. I gave my mother a red cardigan, and the plate fell straight into it. Are you even aware of your actions? I might forgive you if you apologize immediately. Why ought I to? From Evergreen Bank, I'm David. Say you're sorry for being such a loser. Wasn't I just sharing some pickles? He smirked without even trying to hide it. I understand. I can plainly comprehend what you're thinking. Let's transfer the $30 million to a different bank, Mom. He stood there in disbelief, unable to comprehend what was happening. The next day, everything drastically altered, yet he never took me seriously. I'm a 36-year-old ex-banker named Scott. My mother and I were the only ones left when my father died when I was in high school. Using scholarships, I was able to complete my college education, but I left my job shortly after I started working. Since then, my life has finally stabilized and I've adapted to a new work. We went to my mother's favorite BBQ joint today to honor her 60th birthday and to express my gratitude. She was so happy that she put on the red cardigan I gave her as a birthday present immediately away. My mom was contentedly munching on cucumber pickles as we grilled tongue and short ribs. She grinned and continued, even though it was her special day and I wanted her to eat more of the meat she loves. Thank you, but these pickles from the barbecue place are my favorite. I'm also loving the meat, so don't worry. We kept eating happily until the door to the private room burst open, because if my mom is pleased, that's what counts. Hey, isn't Scott there? You appear to be doing well, but I haven't seen you since you ran away from work. My old classmate David, who used to work at the bank, was the voice. As high school classmates, David and I were always vying for the best grades. But I was usually a little bit ahead, which unilaterally made him despise me, so our unplanned encounter was really awkward. He always viewed me as a rival in high school. Don't act snobby just because you're good at studying. Our guest just so happened to be correct this time. Even though he was just as intelligent as I was, his constant defeats of me most likely resulted into animosity. He even continued to be loyal to me while attending the same institution and working at the same Evergreen Bank in the area. After 3 years of employment, the branch manager changed, which caused a change in our relationship. We were pushed to sell goods and services aggressively when the company plan was redesigned. I kept questioning whether our clients were actually benefiting from these goods and services. I started to question if I was truly taking the customer's viewpoint into account as I made offers to devoted clients and won contracts. Even as I adapted to the job, these uncertainties continued to plague me. The transfer order then arrived. Although I was aware that frequent transfers were intended to deter wrongdoing, my mother was the actual issue at the time. The phrase, "don't take your parents for granted," is frequently used. Prior to receiving a major medical diagnosis, my mother had always been in good health. I was shocked and hurried home, where my mother smiled wearily at me. "Despite your busy schedule, I appreciate you coming. Don't worry, though. Surgery should guarantee that my life is not in risk because it was identified early enough." At first, I was relieved, but as our conversation progressed, I came to understand that things weren't as promising as they appeared. Despite the high success rate of the surgery, my mom would have to recuperate at home for a long period, which would make it hard for her to even handle everyday tasks, much less go shopping. She needed help getting to and from the hospital, and she would need urgent care if her condition deteriorated at home. To put it another way, someone would have to help my mom all day. It became evident after talking with my mom's primary care physician that daytime living alone would be difficult. After much consideration, I made the decision to leave the bank in light of my mom's predicament. Moving to a far-off place and leaving my mom alone was not an option, and I had been uncomfortable with the bank's regulations. My boss was sad when I resigned and made an effort to convince me to stay. My mom's health came first, even though I felt bad about leaving a location that had been kind to me. So I walked out of the bank. I haven't had any regrets about my choice in the past 3 years. However, it appeared to be the first time David believed he had defeated me. He approached my desk the day before I was to go, smirking as he said, "Lucky for you that your mom got sick just in time." His unexpected and cruel words shocked me. I was already tense with my mom's upcoming surgery. I couldn't understand how he could say something so cruel at a time like this, but he just watched my speechless reaction and started laughing disdainfully. "Don't make excuses. You just couldn't handle the bank's quotas and ran away because you couldn't cut it in sales, right? Is that all you came to say? Bad timing. I've got handover work to do, so please move aside." I managed to reply, holding back my anger. He scoffed and continued, "Being smart at school doesn't mean you can hack it in the real world. You've never faced failure before, so you were using your mom as an excuse to run away." Without the will to respond, I stayed silent. He got even more aggressive. "Must be nice, but quitting before everyone realizes you're a failure who can't meet company standards. What are you going to do now? Hide at home with your mom?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm staying home to take care of my mom, and I won't be working outside anymore, so leave me alone." I lied hastily to get rid of him. He burst into laughter as if he'd heard the funniest joke, then announced loudly across the office, "Hey, hear that? SC is going to become a shut-in from now on. He's retiring from society to be a bum." In the past, his smirking face would have left me feeling bitter, but now I see it as my final liberation from this unwanted, inseparable relationship with him. I calmly continued preparing the handover documents. After that, my mom successfully underwent her surgery and recovered at home as planned. She regained her health completely, and I began working again, establishing a new lifestyle. One day, we decided to celebrate her 60th birthday and her recovery at a barbecue restaurant, a special treat. She was happy with the present I prepared, and we were having a good time when he suddenly barged in. "I saw you when you went to the restroom earlier and thought it might be you. Turns out it really was Scott, the loser." He smirked as he threw snide remarks at me, despite my mother being present. He barged into our private room to harass us, showing that his character hadn't changed a bit. "Today is my mom's 60th birthday. We're here to enjoy this as a family, so please." I tried to speak calmly, hoping to get him to leave, but seeing an opportunity to tease me, his eyes gleamed with mischief as he decided to stay. "Are you really eating pickles at a barbecue place? Isn't that just the appetizer?" "Oh, I get it. Since you declared you'd be a shut-in and not work, you must be broke now," he said, then smirked and left the room. Relieved he'd given up, I was momentarily at ease until he returned to our private room. He began transferring cucumber pickles from his own plate to ours without permission. "You guys are really saving me here. I can't stand cheap taste like this." I was about to throw these pickles away, he said. "Hey, don't put things on our plates without asking." I protested, but he just looked down on us, grinning. "Be thankful you quit the bank and have no money, right? Even though you're at a barbecue place, you can afford the expensive meat, right?" "That's enough." I raised my voice, but he continued to look down on me condescendingly. "Since you can afford to pay for the meat, I figured I'd share the pickles. Pickles are more than enough for the poor." His voice filled with malice, mercilessly bombarding my mother and me. I really wanted to retaliate strongly, but I managed to restrain myself. Today is a special day, my mother's 60th birthday. If I let anger ruin this joyous occasion, it would only trouble my mother, who was enjoying herself until now. With that in mind, I quietly urged him to leave. Can you please just leave now? Oh, I'm not running away today. Weren't you the one who quit the bank job crying because it was too tough? Looks like you should be the one to leave this restaurant. Spineless. His taunting only made my blood boil, but causing a scene here would only trouble my mother. In the restaurant, I just ran into him today. David is someone I shouldn't even be meeting anymore. He's like a stone on the roadside, a traveler you pass by on a trip, never to see again. No matter how much he insults me, I just need to let it slide for now. If I don't respond, he'll get bored and leave soon. Thinking this, I'd remain silent, but this only seemed to irritate him further. Frustrated, he furrowed his brow and picked up the plate of pickles he had added earlier. Then he deliberately spilled the juicy pickles all over the plate, overturning it right onto the red cardigan I had gifted my mother. Yikes. Oops, sorry about that, ma'am. My hand slipped. He said, offering an insincere apology with a smirk as my mother's cardigan got drenched in pickle juice and cucumber slices. I quickly stood up to ask a server for a towel, but he grabbed a napkin from the table first. I'll wipe it off right away. Oh dear, my hands just slipped, he said, laughing loudly while crushing the cucumbers with a napkin. The smell of crushed cucumbers filled the private room, and a brand new cardigan was left stained. Oh, it was a gift for my mom's 60th birthday. Haha. Sorry about that. Seems like I made it worse. He continued to laugh as if watching a funny skit, enjoying my mother's distress. At that moment, my anger shook me to the core. I could ignore whatever was said to me, but I couldn't forgive him for troubling my mother. David, are you still working at Evergreen Bank at the same branch as before? Yes, that's right. Unlike when you left, I'm about to be the branch manager. I'm the top rising star, an elite among our peers now, different from someone who quit halfway through. His voice echoed in the restaurant, attracting the attention of the staff and other customers who peeked into our private room as he continued to laugh. I stared him down, giving him one last chance. Do you even realize what you've done? Apologize right now, and I might still forgive you. Huh. Why should I? An elite from Evergreen Bank apologizing to a loser like you? I was just sharing some pickles, wasn't I? As he said this, he pointed at the pickle-stained cardigan and didn't even try to hide his smirk. I see. I understand your thoughts clearly, Mom. Let's move the $30 million to another bank. He stood there dumbfounded, unable to grasp the situation. Meanwhile, my mother looked confused at my words. What's going on? You've always wanted to repay your gratitude by dealing only with Evergreen Bank because you were working there after graduation. But a person from Evergreen Bank has insulted you and me. I kept my anger in check, but it seemed my irritation was evident to both my mother and him. I continued staring at his stiffened face. Listen, David, we both have social standings, and we're not kids anymore. If you dare insult us like this in public, you must be prepared for the consequences. So what? He responded brusquely, showing no intention of apology. I sighed deeply and said firmly, I'm done dealing with you. I've decided to transfer the $30 million we have at Evergreen Bank somewhere else. After this, you'll probably understand what kind of a mess you've really caused. What are you talking about? You're saying you have $30 million in deposits. That's not even a good joke. Go ahead and cancel it if you can. It seemed that he still didn't believe I had a $30 million deposit at the bank. It's embarrassing that you'd lie like that. Don't come crying to me when you regret it. If you can withdraw $30 million from our bank, I'll applaud you, but that's impossible for a shut and poor like you. We'll see who regrets it. I've only told the truth. Look forward to what happens tomorrow. With that, I left him sitting there as I got up from the table. As we paid and left the restaurant, he continued to mock us. Do you really think I'd believe such a pathetic bluff? I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to you guys. Ignoring his continued taunts, we headed home from the barbecue restaurant. He thought it was all a lie and didn't take it seriously. But the next day, everything changed. I heard from a former colleague that the Evergreen Bank was flooded with calls right after they opened the next day. Some people even went directly to the bank to inquire, and the staff was overwhelmed with responses. David, who had arrived at work as usual, was summoned by the furious manager. "James, what's all this commotion about today? Did something happen? What have you done?" James, usually calm, yelled as if he had lost control of himself. Veins stood out on his forehead, taken aback by the intensity. David apologized while trying to understand the situation. "The phone lines are almost crashing because of the inquiries about what you did at the barbecue restaurant yesterday." What I did. Go out for barbecue yesterday. Confused, he wiped the sweat off his forehead. Then James showed him a video on his phone. "It seems you caused a disturbance at the barbecue restaurant yesterday. There's a video of it online now, and it's causing a huge problem." The video is online. He grabbed the phone and focused intently on the small screen. The video showed the exchange between him and me from the previous day. "Why is there a video of this?" "I don't know anything about it, but that's you," James said, his voice filled with disbelief. "And the video. David calling someone poor and mocking them. What were you thinking?" James's words made him spit in defiance. "I just ran into an old friend by chance and got carried away joking around. Is it wrong to eat barbecue? And why is this video spreading?" The fuss was so great that a customer at the restaurant recorded everything, then posted it online as a scandal involving a bank employee. At Chain's words, he began to tremble, turning pale. The video had already been viewed over 1 million times, and deleting it now wouldn't suppress the issue. "My elite life is over. How can I solve this problem?" "Your elite life is over. That doesn't matter. What you did is a major issue, but the person you insulted was none other than." As they were talking, other bank employees came to call James and him. My mother and I had just arrived at the bank, as I had declared the day before. I was there to close the account and withdraw the $30 million. However, the counter staff informed me that such a large transaction couldn't be processed there and asked us to come to a private room where James would join us. The bank employee who guided us knew about yesterday's incident, so they decided to have him join the discussion too. David, who rushed in with James, began sweating profusely the moment he saw my mother and me. When James heard from the bank employee that I intended to withdraw the entire $30 million and close the account, he tried his best to persuade me to reconsider. "Please reconsider. Can you at least tell us why?" The reason? He knew it well. Yesterday, when I told him I would close the account, he readily agreed. He must have remembered his defiant words. He looked around uneasily and then took a few steps towards me to speak, but before he could say anything, James dropped a bombshell. "What have you done angering our top client like this? This is irreversible. Scott is a top client. That must be some mistake. He's a quitter who left this bank halfway through," James said. "You're making a terrible mistake, James." His anger seemed incomprehensible to him. He smirked as if he'd heard a joke and spoke dismissively. "Scott is just a poor man. He certainly doesn't have $30 million. James's face, turning red with anger, got even angrier with him as he continued to make excuses. "It's not a misunderstanding. He's saying he wants to withdraw $30 million from his savings. This man is the CEO of a major ID company." James exclaimed, finally realizing the truth of my words. After leaving the bank, I started managing assets from home and saving funds, which I then invested in a startup. By networking with talented entrepreneurs, I eventually founded and now run my own ID company. Hearing my background from James, he stood frozen, his face pale and silent. I spoke slowly to him. "Now, do you understand that I wasn't joking? I can trust a bank where people like you work, but I didn't know. I'll apologize if you want. Just please don't withdraw your money from the bank." He was still condescending, disappointing not just me, but also others. James, who had witnessed everything, looked at him with disdain and anger. "I thought you were a competent banker. What a disappointment." As you heard, ridiculing a customer and showing no remorse questions your integrity. "I cannot entrust my assets to this bank." I reiterated my demand to withdraw the $30 million, and James sighed deeply, reluctantly agreeing. Thus, I withdrew all my assets from Evergreen Bank. He resisted to the end, shouting, "How can someone like you, who ran away from a tough job, succeed enough to have $30 million? Aren't you just a coward?" But I just shook my head calmly. "Why do you criticize leaving so much? Assessing the situation and choosing a different path is not something to be ashamed of. But you abandoned your job and lost to me. Leaving from the workplace is proof of no responsibility." It seemed that being a banker was the only thing he could boast about as a victory over me. Hearing him insist, I felt pity rather than anger. It's great to work hard with responsibility, but no one wants to live with regrets by suppressing what they truly want to do. I recalled the day I decided to resign, faced with a promotion to a distant location and my mother's surgery, followed by difficult home care. When these two futures were presented to me, I chose my mother's health. There are people who will follow the path you aspire to, and there are those who will live like me. Everyone should choose the life that suits them best. You have to decide your own life. How is that different from being selfish? I work hard. I am going to be the most successful person in this bank. I am great. He kept repeating his argument, almost screaming by the end. When someone's thoughts become so rigid, advice from others no longer reaches them. I left the bank feeling sorry. A branch of Evergreen Bank closed down. Months later, I was driving my mother to the hospital. Her illness had fully improved, and now she only needed regular checkups, which was a relief. On the way to the hospital, we passed the location where Evergreen Bank once stood. The grand building had been demolished, leaving a clean slate. "That David person was your classmate, wasn't he?" my mother asked. "I'm sorry. My 60th birthday celebration triggered all this," I replied. "No, it's okay. He's always been like that, and it's good that the branch closed down," I said. My comment about the closure wasn't a joke. This information comes from a new acquaintance in the finance industry. According to him, ever since James took charge, the branch's reputation among customers had steadily declined. James had favored David, a high-performing banker, and together they changed management policies. Even during my time, we were forced to sell unnecessary products to customers. After I left, their methods became more blatant, treating customers who refused products as poor and behaving arrogantly while being overly courteous to big clients. This unfair treatment had been problematic for a while, and there were frequent complaints against Evergreen Bank itself. With the recent scandal, the bank could no longer protect James and David. As Evergreen Bank was already reducing staff by merging branches, they quickly decided to close the branch where David worked. Other bank employees were given placements elsewhere, but James and David were not offered decent transfers and were assigned to a department that only organized old documents all day. David, with his bruised pride, resigned voluntarily after enduring about a month. "I deserve a much better job," he declared, slamming his resignation letter down before leaving the bank. James tried to cling to his job, but after David left, he was solely blamed for the branch's closure. Unable to withstand the cold treatment from colleagues and bosses, he followed David in resignation. Afterwards, James searched for a new job but couldn't find employment within the same industry due to his tarnished reputation. Nevertheless, needing to make a living, he eventually found a job as a bank security guard. Once a manager pushing unnecessary products for performance, he now finds himself humbly responding to customer complaints. On the other hand, David's life took a harsh turn after his wife divorced him and took their children with her. Forced to sell his home to pay for the divorce settlement and property division, he now lives alone in a cheap apartment. Currently, He works as a part-time employee at a local supermarket, struggling to make ends meet and pay child support. Interestingly, his manager and supervisor are former high school classmates whom he used to mock, but now he has no choice but to diligently follow their orders. He is assigned to the deli section where he sells items like potato salad and pickles daily. However, still clinging to his elitist attitude, he grumbles, "How can someone like me deal with something as poor-looking as pickles?" and neglects proper stock management. This results in poor sales, leading to frequent lectures from his once classmate, now supervisor. One can only hope that he will reflect on his behavior and change his way of living. As for my mother and me, we decided to redo her 60th birthday celebration. This whole experience made me reconsider what I truly value. I was reaffirmed that resigning was the right decision, and I felt deeply content with my choice. Mom, happy 60th birthday again. Without you, I wouldn't have had the chance to close that account. Let's continue to enjoy life in good health, I said. Thank you. I'm proud of you, my mother replied, smiling gently, obviously pleased. Motivated by these sentiments, I resolved to keep following the path I believe in. As I reflect on these thoughts, I open my computer again today to complete my work with pride.
My mother-in-law slapped me hard and kicked me out of the car because I voted for Donald Trump on Election Day 2024. A staunch supporter of Kamala Harris, she had forced me to vote for her, but I refused. My husband stood by his mother, leaving me feeling betrayed. Determined to take control, I decided to unleash a powerful secret the very next day. I gave them a shocking surprise. My name is Emma, and I want to share my story. A journey filled with love, betrayal, and ultimately empowerment. I'm a 30-year-old English teacher, and my life was once a beautiful tapestry woven with dreams and hopes. I married Daniel, my husband, 2 years ago. He is 32 and works in the excise and tax department. At first, everything seemed perfect. Our love was strong, and our future looked bright. We had a lovely wedding surrounded by friends and family. Daniel was caring and attentive, and I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. We shared countless adventures, from weekend getaways to quiet nights spent reading together. But as time went on, that fairy tale began to fray at the edges, and the cracks in our relationship started to show. One of the biggest challenges in our marriage was Daniel's mother, Grace. At 58, she was a retired woman who had always been very controlling, and from the moment I entered their family, I felt her disapproval like a heavy cloud hanging over me. It started small, with little comments that seemed harmless but stung nonetheless. "You really should try to cook better, Emma," she'd say. "Daniel deserves a wife who can provide a good meal." It was as if she had appointed herself my judge and jury. I often tried to brush off her remarks, thinking that I could win her over eventually. After all, I loved Daniel, and I want his family to love me too. But every time I stepped into their home, I could feel Grace's piercing gaze and her judgmental silence. I was a stranger in my own home, constantly striving to meet her impossible standards. The tension escalated, and soon it became unbearable. Daniel was caught in the middle. I could see how much he cared for his mother and how desperately he wanted to please her. But it hurt me that he couldn't see how much his mother's words affected me. "She's just old-fashioned, Emma," he would say. "You have to give her time to warm up to you." I wanted to believe that, but I felt like a guest in my own marriage, waiting for permission to exist. The only person who truly understood my plight was my best friend, Sarah. She's also 30 and works as a lawyer. Sarah had always been my rock, providing support and a listening ear when I needed it most. "You deserve to be happy, Emma," she would say. "You can't let Grace control your life like this." I often confided in her about my frustrations, but it seemed like no matter how much I tried, things only got worse. As we approached the 2024 U.S. election, the tension in our household escalated to a new level. I was a staunch supporter of the Republican Party and had my hopes pinned on Donald Trump. Grace, on the other hand, was a devoted follower of the Democratic Party and wanted to see Kamala Harris win. It was like a storm brewing on the horizon, and I could feel the pressure building. Emma, you have to vote for Kamala, Grace insisted one evening. It's your duty as an American. I could feel my blood boiling. But I support Trump, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. I believe in his policies. Grace's face turned a shade of crimson, and I knew I had crossed an invisible line. Don't be ridiculous. You're supposed to be a part of this family. You should support what I support, she barked. Daniel sat silently, a deer caught in headlights, unwilling to take sides. I felt utterly alone, as if the very ground beneath me was crumbling away. How could I stand by and allow her to dictate my beliefs? Election Day, January 5th, 2024, arrived with a mix of excitement and dread. Daniel, Grace, and I piled into the car, tension thick in the air. As we drove to the polling station, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Remember, Emma, you need to vote for Kamala, Grace reiterated, her tone leaving no room for argument. I'll vote for who I believe in, I replied defiantly, my heart racing. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I could feel Daniel shifting uncomfortably in his seat. After casting our votes, we headed back home. The air was electric with unspoken words. Suddenly, Grace turned to me, her voice laced with a false sweetness. So, did you vote for Kamala? She asked, her eyes narrowing. I hesitated, knowing the consequences of my answer. But I couldn't lie. No, I voted for Trump, I said firmly. In that moment, I felt as if time stood still. The rage that erupted from Grace was like a tidal wave. How dare you disobey me? She shouted, her voice cutting through the silence. You should be ashamed of yourself. I braced myself as her hand flew across my face in a sudden slap, the sting shocking me into silence. Daniel pulled the car over, panic rising in his eyes. Mom, stop it, he pleaded, but Grace was beyond reason. Get out of my car, she screamed, her eyes blazing with fury. My heart raced, and a mix of disbelief and humiliation washed over me as she kicked me out onto the roadside. Stranded and alone, I watched as Daniel hesitated, torn between the two of us. I can't believe this is happening, I whispered to myself, feeling the weight of betrayal crash over me like a wave. I had to take control. I couldn't let this define me. I reached for my phone and called Sarah, my voice trembling as I explained what had just happened. Stay there, I'm coming to get you, she said without hesitation. As I waited for her to arrive, I felt a fire igniting inside me, a need for revenge, a need to reclaim my life. Little did I know that this was only the beginning of my fight for freedom. As I stood by the roadside, my heart pounded in my chest. I felt a whirlwind of emotions swirling within me, anger, humiliation, and an overwhelming desire to break free from the grip of my mother-in-law, Grace. The shock of being thrown out of the car lingered, and I knew I could not let this moment pass without taking action. I looked down the road, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sarah's car, my heart racing with anticipation. When Sarah arrived, her expression was a mix of concern and fury. Emma, what happened? She asked, rushing toward me. I quickly recounted the entire ordeal, from the car ride to the shocking slap that left a stinging mark on my cheek. I can't believe she did that, Sarah exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief. You have every right to be angry. As we drove away from that desolate spot, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. What am I going to do? I asked Sarah, my voice trembling. I can't go back to that house. I can't keep living like this. Sarah nodded, her eyes focused on the road. You need to take a stand, Emma. You deserve to be treated with respect. This isn't just about your mother-in-law. It's about your marriage and your happiness. I considered her words carefully. The idea of confronting Grace and Daniel terrified me, but the thought of continuing to live in fear and resentment was worse. You're right, I said slowly, a spark of determination igniting within me. I need to fight back. I need to show them that I won't be pushed around anymore. We decided to go to my apartment, a small sanctuary I had kept despite living with Daniel and Grace. It was my space, filled with my books and memories, and I felt a sense of safety as I stepped inside. Let's take action, Sarah said, her voice resolute. We need to document what happened. I nodded, remembering the sting of Grace's slap. I'll go to the hospital and get a medical report, I replied, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. I wanted to hold Grace accountable for her actions, and I knew this was the first step. After a quick visit to the hospital, where I received a medical report confirming the physical assault, we headed to the police station. The gravity of what I was about to do weighed heavily on me. Would they take me seriously? Would Grace retaliate? But I steeled myself, remembering how powerless I felt just hours earlier. When we walked into the station, the officer at the desk looked up, his expression shifting from indifference to concern as I explained my situation. I need to file a report against my mother-in-law for assault, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. She slapped me during an argument. The officer listened intently, taking notes as I spoke. I felt a sense of empowerment wash over me with each word. We have medical evidence, Sarah interjected, holding up the report. This needs to be taken seriously. The officer nodded, his demeanor changing as he recognized the seriousness of the situation. We'll need to take your statement, and we can begin an investigation. After what felt like hours, I left the police station with a mix of relief and fear. I had taken the first step in reclaiming my power, but I knew there was a long road ahead. The next day, I received a call from the police informing me that Grace had been arrested and charged with physical assault and harassment. My heart raced at the news. It felt surreal to think that my mother-in-law was behind bars. That evening, I received a text from Daniel. I'm sorry for everything, Emma. I want to talk. Please come home. My heart sank at the thought of returning to that house, to the very place that had become a battleground. I hesitated, but decided I needed to face him, to confront the man who had stood by while I was being mistreated. When I arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Daniel was waiting in the living room, his expression a mix of concern and guilt. Emma, I'm so sorry about what happened. I should have defended you, he began, his voice heavy with regret. I crossed my arms, feeling the weight of his apologies. You should have, Daniel, I said, my voice firm. You let her treat me like I'm nothing. I can't be in a marriage where I'm not respected or defended. He looked down, shame etched across his face. I thought it would blow over. I didn't know she would go that far. Do you realize how this affects our relationship? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. I feel betrayed. I thought we were a team. He looked up, desperation in his eyes. I love you, Emma. I want to make this right. I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. You need to choose, Daniel. You need to stand up to your mother and support me. He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. I will. I promise. But even as he spoke those words, I felt a pit in my stomach. How could I trust him again? How could I believe that he would finally choose me over Grace? The night wore on, and as we talked, I realized that our marriage had already been irrevocably changed. I had begun to see Daniel not just as my partner, but as a man caught in a web of familial loyalty, unable to break free. When I returned to my apartment that night, I felt a mixture of hope and despair. I was finally standing up for myself, but I knew the battle was far from over. I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for the future I wanted to reclaim. The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. I would file for divorce. I had to free myself from this toxic relationship and start anew. But as I sat on my couch, contemplating my next steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace wouldn't take her arrest lying down. She would fight back, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. With the decision to file for divorce weighing heavily on my mind, I knew I had to prepare for the fallout. The morning after speaking with Daniel, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. I needed to meet with a lawyer, someone who could guide me through this process and help me reclaim my life. Sarah, ever supportive, offered to come with me. You don't have to do this alone, Emma. I'll be right by your side, she assured me, her presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't fighting this battle in isolation. As we walked into the lawyer's office, I was struck by the stark reality of what I was about to undertake. I had never envisioned myself in this situation, facing a divorce. I never wanted it to come to this, I confessed to Sarah as we waited. But I can't live like this anymore. She squeezed my hand, her encouragement bolstering my spirits. The lawyer, Ms. Johnson, greeted us with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "Let's get started," she said, motioning for us to take a seat. As I shared my story, the assault, the control, the betrayal, I could feel the weight lifting slightly. Ms. Johnson listened intently, taking notes and nodding empathetically. "You've done the right thing by seeking help, Emma. We'll make sure you're protected and can start anew." After discussing my options, we began drafting the divorce papers. It felt surreal, putting my name on a document that would sever ties with Daniel. I had hoped for a different outcome, for a marriage filled with love and respect, but the reality was stark. Grace's influence over our lives had turned our relationship into a battlefield, and I had to reclaim my identity. As I left the office, a sense of empowerment surged through me. I was taking control of my life. Yet, beneath that empowerment lay an undercurrent of fear. What would Grace do once she learned about the divorce? I could already imagine her fury. I knew I had to brace myself for the storm that was likely brewing. Later that evening, I received a call from the police. "Emma, we need to inform you that your mother-in-law has been released," the officer said. My heart raced.
"What?"
"How is that possible?" I stammered. "She was arrested for assault." The officer explained that the charges had been reduced due to a lack of prior offenses. "We're keeping an eye on her, but she's free to go." Panic surged through me. Grace would come after me. I felt vulnerable, exposed. What should I do? I asked the officer, my voice trembling. "Just be cautious and document anything unusual. If she approaches you or harasses you, contact us immediately," he advised. That night, I barely slept, haunted by thoughts of Grace's wrath. I kept replaying the slap, the humiliation, and the moment she had kicked me out of the car. I had stood up for myself, but would it be enough? I decided to call Sarah and share my fears. "I'm terrified, Sarah. What if she comes after me?" I said, my voice shaky. "You have every right to be scared, but you're stronger than you think," she replied firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Days turned into weeks, and the tension was palpable. I moved forward with the divorce proceedings, and while I felt empowered, I also felt like I was walking on eggshells. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart raced, wondering if it would be a message from Daniel or, worse, from Grace. Finally, the day arrived when I had to meet Daniel to discuss the divorce. My stomach churned with anxiety. Would he support me, or would he fall back into his old patterns of placating his mother? As I drove to our meeting place, I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had made my choice for a reason. When I saw him, his expression was a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I'm glad we're talking," he said softly, avoiding my gaze. "I know things have been difficult, but I want to find a way to fix this." "I don't think we can fix this, Daniel," I replied, my voice steady. "I need to do what's best for me, and that means moving on without you." He looked pained, but I knew deep down that this was the only way for me to reclaim my life. As we spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what lay below. The path forward was fraught with challenges, and I had no idea how Grace would react to the news of my divorce. But I was determined to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. As the days passed, the tension in my life seemed to escalate. I was deep in the divorce process, and with every document signed, I felt a mix of empowerment and anxiety. I knew Grace wouldn't take my decision lying down, and I had to prepare for the inevitable fallout. My heart raced whenever I received a notification on my phone, fearing it might be from her. One evening, while I was at home going over divorce papers, my phone rang. It was Sarah. "Emma, you need to come over." "Now," she said, urgency in her voice. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "It's Grace. I think she's been looking for you." My heart sank. "Meet me at my place in 15 minutes, she instructed. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. What was Grace planning? I quickly gathered my things and drove to Sarah's apartment, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Sarah was pacing the living room, her brow furrowed with worry. I heard from one of my contacts that Grace has been asking around about you, she explained. She's furious about the divorce. I'm worried she might try to confront you. Just as Sarah finished speaking, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Daniel. I can't believe you're doing this, Emma. You're tearing our family apart. I felt my anger flare. He's still trying to defend her, I muttered, my fists clenching. He should be defending me. Sarah nodded sympathetically. You need to focus on your safety and well-being right now. Let's call the police and let them know about Grace's behavior. It was a proactive step, and I agreed. I was determined not to be a victim in this situation. We made the call, and after a brief discussion, the officer assured us they would increase patrols around my apartment. Just stay vigilant, he advised. I took a deep breath, grateful for the support, but the fear still lingered. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning, imagining the worst. The next day, I decided to visit my therapist to talk through my fears and the anger I felt toward Grace. It's essential to express how you feel, my therapist advised. You've been through a lot, and it's okay to feel angry. I nodded, feeling the weight of my emotions. As I left the session, I felt a renewed sense of strength. I was determined not to let Grace control my life any longer. I would not be defined by her actions. I returned home, resolved to take back my power. Just when I thought I could breathe again, I received an unexpected visit. It was Daniel, standing at my door with an expression of desperation. Emma, please let me explain, he pleaded. I've realized how wrong I've been. Where was this realization when your mother slapped me? I shot back, my voice steady. You should have defended me, Daniel. I can't trust you. He looked crushed, and part of me felt pity for him. I want to make this right, he insisted. I need to move on, Daniel. This is about my happiness now, I replied firmly. You have to accept that. As he left, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. I was finally reclaiming my life. A few days later, I received a call from my lawyer. The divorce was finalized. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, freedom, and a sense of hope. But just when I thought I was free, Grace made her final move. She showed up at my apartment one afternoon, her face a mask of anger. You think you can just walk away from my family? She yelled, her voice echoing in the hallway. You're nothing without us. Leave me alone, Grace. You've done enough damage, I shouted back, my heart racing. But this time, I stood my ground. I had the police on my side, and I wasn't afraid of her anymore. In that moment, I realized the truth. I was stronger than I had ever believed. I had fought for my dignity, and I refused to let anyone take that away from me. I watched as Grace's anger morphed into confusion, and for the first time, I felt a sense of victory. As she turned and walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had survived the storm, and now I was ready to embrace the future, my future. I would move forward with my life, focusing on my career, my friendships, and rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I poured my energy into teaching, finding joy in my students and the lessons I shared. I reconnected with Sarah, and our friendship deepened as we supported each other through life's challenges. Most importantly, I learned to love myself again. The journey had been painful, but I emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. I had broken free from the chains of a toxic relationship, and as I looked ahead, I felt a sense of hope and excitement for the life that awaited me. I had chosen my path, and now I was determined to walk it with confidence and grace.